We have been talking before about public and private subnets. Now, when we have private subnets, we may want to implement something called a bastion host. This helps us connect to instances on our private subnets. And in this lesson, we're going to go into a little bit more detail about public versus private subnets and how we can use bastion hosts. So, we have a region, and within that region, we have created a VPC. Then we have an availability zone, and we have a public subnet. Now, the public subnet has a routing table associated with it, and that routing table has a route to the internet. So, let's take a look at the routing table here. The first entry in the routing table says essentially any other address. Basically, anything that's not within this range will match this rule. And this rule says go to an internet gateway. So, the internet gateway is the path to the outside world. And it basically means that if you're not sending a network communication within the CIDR address block for the VPC, then you must route to the internet. The second address is the CIDR block, so it's the general address block for the VPC. So, what that means is that any address block on the VPC will be within this address range. Now, if you are sending a network communication and it is within this address block, what will happen is that it will be routed locally. That means it will use the VPC router, which is routed within your VPC. Then we have our private subnet. A private subnet has a separate routing table, and the key difference here is that it does not have a route to the internet. You cannot connect an internet gateway to a private subnet. Now, what's the real difference? It's really just configuration. With a public subnet, we configure it to assign public IP addresses to instances. Therefore, every instance you start by default will have a public IP address. With respect to the private subnet, we just don't configure that option. And it's actually the default option when you create a subnet. That means that we're not going to have public IP addresses assigned to instances in the private subnet. And, therefore, without a public address, they can't use an internet gateway. So, even if you had an internet gateway specified in the routing table, it wouldn't work. So, the two key attributes here to make this a private subnet are that we are not assigning public IP addresses to our instances, and that we have an associated routing table that does not have an internet gateway attached to it. Therefore, our instances are private. They cannot communicate with the outside world, and the outside world cannot communicate with the private subnet. But we still have the inbound routing inside the VPC, which means that communication between public and private subnets can still occur. I explain all this in detail so that you can understand it very well. So, let's say we launch a couple of instances, one on our public subnet and one on our private subnet. Now, of course, these subnets could be in different availability zones. That doesn't matter. That doesn't change this configuration. The availability zone is not important here. What's important is that we have one instance on the public subnet and one instance on a private subnet, and we want to be able to connect to our instance on our private subnet. We have an internet gateway, and we want to be able to connect from a computer in the outside world to our instance on our private subnet. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, actually, we can't, because remember, there is no way for instances on the private subnet to communicate with an internet gateway. They have no route and they have no public IP address. So, what we're going to do here is connect to our instance on the public subnet. The instance has a public IP address and is on a subnet that has a routing table associated with it, with a route to an internet gateway that allows bidirectional communication to and from the internet. So, what can we do now that we have connected to this EC2 instance using SSH, for example, or RDP if it is a Windows instance? We can jump to our instance on the private subnet using private IP addresses. So, this instance and this instance have a private IP within this range, which means that there is already a rule or an entry in the routing table that allows them to communicate using the local destination, which is the VPC router, which is not shown here, but it does exist. So, This is where we use this instance on the public subnet as something we call a bastion host or a hop host. And that simply means that we're connecting to this instance, and then from here, we connect to our instance on a private subnet. So now you know a lot more about public and private subnets and also how to use bastion hosts. So what we're going to do now is we're going to demonstrate and we're going to put this explanation into practice. Okay, here in the VPC panel, I have the VPC AWS labs that we created in the Amazon VPC section. It has a CIDR block 10.10.0.0/23. In subnets, you can see that I have two within the VPC AWS labs VPC, a public subnet and a private subnet. If I select the public subnet, I go to route table. Notice that it has a route to an internet gateway that is associated to the VPC for this demo. If I select the private subnet, notice that it does not have a route to an internet gateway, unlike the public subnet which does. If I go to Actions and enter Edit Subnet Configuration, notice that it does not have the automatic public IPv4 address assignment checkbox enabled. This confirms that if I launch an EC2 instance within this private subnet, it will not have a public IP address. I cancel this and select the public subnet, Actions, and enter Edit Subnet Configuration. Notice that it has the automatic public IPv4 address assignment checkbox enabled. It means that instance that I launch in this public subnet will have public IP address, and due to the routing table that has an internet gateway associated with it, it will also be able to go out to the internet. Now, if I go to the EC2 dashboard, running instances, notice that I have my two instances that come out in the diagram. The public instance, it has public IP. The private instance, it doesn't. It doesn't have internet access. So, let's quickly see how we connect to the private instance from my personal Mac. I'm going to open my terminal. The first thing I'm going to do is connect to the public instance. For that, we do it by first typing SSHI. I give it the path where I have downloaded the key pair, EC2 user, Aruba, then the public IP of that instance. I press enter. And I'm connected. In fact, if I type pinggoogle.com, notice that I get a response because it has internet access. Now, to connect to the private instance, using its private IP, we can do it right here by typing SSHI/home/EC2 user /labvpn.pem, which is the key pair name, EC2 user, Aruba, the private IP of that instance. I press enter, and I'm already connected, and we have done it thanks to host Bastion on the public subnet. If I want to ping google.com, notice that I get no response because, again, this instance has no internet access. This is how host Bastion works. See you next time.